My name is Micah MacColl Nicholson. I am the program assistant for Quaker Outreach here at FCNL. So I am a part of one of the other wonderful young adult programs that FCNL has for young adults like us. I recently graduated from Earlham College, which I know there's a cohort here from Earlham. And I got a degree in social services and education. So my background, unlike some of the people I work with, is in community development and community building, focusing on the connections that we can make with the people around us. And I think that's a really important part of the work we do and can do in politics. So Rachel, you were going to introduce yourself. If there's anything in addition for this workshop.
Not much. Other than that, I'll say, I got involved about two and a half years ago with Truth and Healing Commission, with advocacy work with FCNL. And I had the opportunity to actually lobby on a Truth and Healing Commission in 2022, which was like one of the first constituent lobby visits that happened on this issue. And that experience, it wasn't ideal. We'll talk about that a little more, but it taught me a lot of really valuable lessons about communicating with people that I don't agree with and I don't see eye to eye with. So I've seen this presentation like twice at Spring Lobby Weekend. And so I'm really excited to, be a part of it and share my experience with you.
So with that, I will give you some context for this work. So we are focusing on persuasive conversations. We, as FCNL and as young advocates, want to lobby and convince Congress to do what we want them to do. We want them to make sure that our voices are uplifted in these conversations and on topics that we find important. Another context of this work and this presentation specifically is that we will be demonstrating some tools and techniques that are available to you in these conversations. It is not a catch-all for how you can go about these lobbying conversations, but we hope that they will be useful to you as you think about lobbying at the end of this weekend. The final piece of context for this conversation and our work in general is that we do operate within a system, Congress, and in general, the US government system. And we want to acknowledge that that system is based on white supremacy and white supremacy culture. So although it can be frustrating, we know that there are avenues that we can enact change within that. Two things can be true. The system can be flawed, and it can also be an avenue for change. So a quick overview of this presentation, since I always appreciate knowing what I'm getting myself into. We will be starting with some opening framing that Larissa and Rachel will get into about why we should even talk with people we disagree with. It can be uncomfortable, it can be frustrating, but it can be really important. Next, we will do some spiritual grounding. As the program assistant for Quaker Outreach and working at FCNL, a Quaker lobbying organization, this is really important in the work that we do. And we'll also do a little experience that'll give a teaser for some of the Quaker worship time we'll have throughout the weekend. After that, Rachel will get into her story. We've titled it Friend or Foe, where the story begins, about her first time lobbying on this commission. Then we will get into the skills building. This will be the big part of this workshop, learning about how you can talk with people you don't agree with and what knowledge, preparation, and techniques you can use in those situations. This will be touching on moral foundations theory and moral reframing demonstrations. Then Rachel will wrap up talking about where the story ends and where the story continues with this office that she lobbied on 2 years ago. Then we'll wrap up and you will be on your way then learning about how you can craft your own stories on this work. That sound good? Some head nods? Want to make sure you're awake? So some opening framing.
Yeah, so Friends in Unlikely Places, Engaging with Those You Don't Agree With is a presentation workshop that has been offered, like I said, at a few previous Spring Lobby weekends, but that we really wanted to put on the main stage and uplift this year to have everyone learn and practice these important skills about speaking across difference. So our goal is that these skills will serve you while you're lobbying this weekend and after you leave DC.
Yeah. Something that I've learned in my personal life and professional life is that talking with people is just intimidating. At least that's the way I feel, whether it's lobbying Congress or talking with friends, especially when you disagree on something. And it's a skill that you have to cultivate on how to approach that and how to make sure that you learn how to build connection with the things you agree on and how to move forward and acknowledge the things that you disagree on. We're both coming to conversations or contexts with background, with context, with experiences that shape the way we view the world and problem solve. And those are really important to understand as we get into persuasive conversations.
So we have a couple reasons that will come up on the screen about why we believe it's important to engage with people who disagree with you. We just touched on it a little bit. It can be hard work. It can be challenging to be met with views that are not your own, especially when you just really disagree. And it does take physical, emotional, spiritual energy. We don't want that to be unsaid. And so that's why we're mentioning it so often. And that's why we're giving you these tools. So first it says listening/learning. And we mentioned, we are a Quaker organization. Seeing the good/humanity in another person that does exist in that other person, when you don't understand their interests or positions, how do you do that? You do that by listening. So listening will help broaden your perspective and allow you to understand the other person's point of view so as to possibly, hopefully, come to common ground, even if you cannot agree fully 100% on the issue itself. So then we see there's polarization, obviously. There is a lot about our world. There's a lot of media out there that really pushes us into, very specific bubbles sometimes. And it can be very hard to not have those bubbles just constantly reinforced with our existing views. And having regular interactions with all kinds of people is necessary to see them as complex humans more than just a collection of beliefs. We also have pragmatism. No change will happen, just very clearly, very realistically, if no one changes their mind. And it, again, might be hard, but we believe that it has to happen. Dialoguing with members of Congress and other decision makers is dialoguing with power to make a difference in people's lives. Even small changes in belief and action can have big impacts. There's also harm reduction. So like pragmatism, dialogue can be a way of working within the system to reduce harm where possible, and to also hear perspectives and experiences that are not as easily visible in a system with multiple levels of societal, structural, and direct violence. Another layer, dialogue helps us see people we disagree with as worthy of our time rather than easily dismissible. And finally, setting reasonable expectations and goals. So the most likely outcome, we're not going to be unrealistic. You might still disagree. You're not going to get exactly on the same page just by using these tools, but you will have learned something about that other person, and you have a basis to continue your relationship. You have a starting point. You can meet them where they're at now that you know where they're at. And that can give more opportunities to dialogue and influence one another's thinking. So on that note, sorry, I had to move my notes. I want to pass it over now to Rachel to actually share the story that we're going to use as an example of how you can use some of these tools.
Yeah, so this is just calling back my first ever experience. It's like my second time in an office and first time lobbying on a Truth in Healing Commission in 2022. And so this was with one of my South Dakota legislators and then a small group of other constituents that I was, meeting with. So I had, never lobbied before, definitely not on this issue. And I was really wide-eyed and whoa. And maybe a little overconfident too. I really thought, I kind of knew my stuff, which I did, but, in another way, I really didn't. And so our lobby visit took place in this huge conference room, which had this massive bison head, or Tatanka, if you're from South Dakota, massive bison head sticking out of the wall. And so that was already, just to set the stage, super intimidating. And, when we were led into the room, the staffer had printed out the entire Truth in Healing Commission bill, which was pretty large. It was a pretty thick stack of paper. So as we all, we sat down around the table, we all sat down. He slammed slammed the bill down onto the table so hard that the binder clip holding the papers actually broke, and they just spread all over the table, all for us to see. And as he did this, he said, "Well, this is quite the piece of legislation you have here." Not a great tone to start off with. Not a great, I was a little scared already. That didn't really put me at ease. And the rest of the meeting went kind of about as well as you would expect. So my fellow delegation members, we were like, don't know what to do with that. So we just continued with our planned lobby visit that we had set out. We talked about how important the bill is to address historical trauma among Native communities, how it had impacted equity between Native and non-Native members in South Dakota, and how it was a just response to past wrongdoing that would be necessary to address, the past of the U.S. government. Staffer was, obviously not impressed, and instead talked about how the legislator was already supporting a different piece of legislation called the Respect Act, or repealing existing substandard provisions, encouraging conciliation with tribes act. It's not a mouthful at all. This act, which actually passed at the end of 2022, repealed 11 outdated federal laws, including laws around boarding schools that took Native children from their families. So a really important part of this work on reconciliation, but again, not the only part, not what we were there to advocate for. And after that meeting, took a breath, took a pause, and I cried. I was so upset. I felt completely disrespected, completely wronged, and not heard. There is a happier end to the story, which we'll get to. And I have to credit not only my fellow delegation members who helped me talk through and process the disrespect that we received, and then ultimately craft a response, but also the tools that we had learned earlier in the weekend from this workshop. Looking back at the way that the visit went, there were some questions that run through my mind. First, what prompted that response from the staffer? How could we have moved the conversation forward towards the goal we were trying to reach, while not excusing this really harmful behavior? And was there something we should have known before going into that meeting? In the next 50 minutes or so, we will work on providing some possible answers to those questions that many of us might have in doing this lobbying work with people who hold opposing views.
Thank you, Rachel. So we want to reiterate that is not the common lobbying experience, but it is an important example to work through, because there are moments where you will disagree with staffers, where you might not get the reaction that you want to, and we want to equip you to be powerful advocates in those moments. As we do this, we want to connect back to some of our Quaker beliefs and practices. And I don't know about you, but every time I hear that story, I get a little emotional and I get a little tense. One, because I call Rachel a friend, and two, because lobby visits can be filled with emotions and emotional responses, especially when we care about the topics that we're lobbying on. So before we continue, and as a little teaser, as I mentioned, for the power of Quaker practices in worship, I encourage you, although it may seem a little silly, but if I'm doing it in front of 300 people, you can do it from your seats. But what I do is I put my feet on the ground. Sometimes I close my eyes, sometimes I don't. I take a deep breath, like a whole body filling breath. And then, this is the silly part, I let go of that tension. Just shake it out. Just shake it out. You do it. I'm watching you guys. You got to shake it out. Shake out the tension, shake out the emotions, and settle back in to the powerful advocates that you are all becoming. Yeah, it was a little bit silly, but sometimes we need silly. So some of this Quaker practices and Quaker grounding, FCNL, the Friends Committee on National Legislation, is a Quaker lobbying organization. So the work we do is grounded in our beliefs and foundations of Quaker practices and principles. The first of which is that every person has direct access to a higher power. In the religion, this is seen and experienced as people being able to receive messages from a higher power, but especially within government, I see it as I, as a 22-year-old woman, can walk into a congressional office and make changes. It might not be in the ways that I want them to, and it might not make as much impact as the President of the United States does, but I can still make a powerful impact if I'm able to use my voice. The next is that we believe that there is something sacred within each person. We say it as seeing that of God. I like to reframe it sometimes as seeing that of good in each person, even if it can sometimes be hard to acknowledge that. Sometimes you have to dig a little and really look with caring and loving eyes into another person. The next is this Quaker concept of way opening. It's something that we see as, even if you do not know the end result of the way something is going to turn out, by doing what you know is right, what we call right action, ways and paths and opportunities for connection can open in ways that you could have never planned. And I've seen that happen a lot in this work. The final part of this, and in kind of connection to way opening, is about long-term goals and incremental change. We know that one lobby visit isn't going to change the whole of US politics. It might not even change, it's not going to change everything. And we might not get everything that we want to out of it, but we are the people who have the power to change. We are the people who have the power to have loving interactions with people, even if they frustrated us, even if they may be on the other side of the aisle or ideology as us. And we hope, even if you aren't Quaker, even if you aren't religious or spiritual in any way, that this can ground you in this work that can be difficult. So with that, there's a quote from one of our former FCNL legislative directors who speaks my mind on the anxiety part of speaking to people sometimes. But Ruth Flower stated that when I enter an office to lobby anybody, I'm always nervous. And I do remind myself that God is in the room. And there is that of God in everyone, including myself, and in the person I'm speaking with. If you can take this quote and the essence of that, of seeing that of good, of that of God within any person. With that, we're going to get into the thick of it. So I hope that you will take notes or take pictures of the slides, because this information will serve you not only in your lobbying experience at the end of this weekend, but also in interactions that you'll have for the rest of your life. So, introductions to moral foundations. And I promise I will be not quick, but I won't bore us with all of the details. But moral foundations theory was created by Jonathan Haidt in 2013. And it's why good people are divided by religion and politics. Haidt outlined 5 moral foundations that all people have, whether they realize it or not. And we use these to understand how we can interact with persuasive conversations. Feinberg and Willer used that reframing to create moral reframing, using those moral foundations effectively to make persuasive conversations more impactful for themselves and make their impact more heard and felt. So we're gonna get into that. There is some conceptual framing for political disagreement that adds on to this thoughts of moral foundation and the moral reframing. The first that we really want to highlight is that you need to separate the person from their values and from the issues. Every person has that of God within them, as we believe in the Quaker tradition, and we want to separate that from the issue that we are entering into a lobby visit to make changes on, because the person has sacredness and they deserve value. Their experience has value. Those values inform their beliefs on the issue and their problem solvings and approaches to the issue, but they're separate. The decisions that they make on an issue are based on the values, and they are all connected, but we want to make sure that we are acknowledging that that person, no matter if you disagree with them, no matter if they frustrate you, still deserve love and respect. You can also see this as an iceberg. The issue that you're either disagreeing or agreeing on is usually easier to understand. The types of communications you're having, you can parse through, you can hear and see the way it's going. But underneath all of that are the values that you are bringing to that conversation, the values that they're bringing to that conversation, and also the contexts that are at play. I'll go back because Rachel, you go, Ben.
Sure. So there are 5 common moral foundations. And they're recurring over and over again across like ethnic and racial and cultural divides and backgrounds. They're common among all people. So since we've just like kind of talked at you for a while, so we are going to move into a little audience participation. So fun. So, Micah controls the clicker, but I am going to show you 5 sets of images, one at a time. And each set represents one of the 5 moral foundations. So as you see each set of images, just quickly shout out, we'll take about 15 seconds per slide, just shout out the words that the images bring to mind. So we'll move to the first one.
and shout it out.
Yeah. Okay, unity. Community. What else do we hear? Action, effort. Awesome. Collaboration, love it. So this is, some of you got it, belonging and community, sometimes called group loyalty or loyalty. So this foundation is related to our long history as like social creatures able to form shifting coalitions. So it underlies values of patriotism and self-sacrifice for the group, and it's active anytime people feel that it's one for all and all for one. So an example of a community you could belong to would be your country. It could be your school. It could be a group at school. It could be your family, or, you know, a broader sort of political group or movement. All right, next slide. What do we hear? Shout out. Authority. All right, what else? Fear. Leadership. Okay, love it. So this, yeah, you got it, is respect for authority. So this foundation was shaped by our long history of hierarchical, in a hierarchy, social interactions. It underlies virtues of leadership and followership, including deference to legitimate authority and respect for traditions. So for example, if I go to the doctor and the doctor says, hey, Rachel, you need toe surgery, I'm going to be like, well, doctor, you went to medical school for 8 years, and so I'm deferring to your authority that I need toe surgery. So that's one example. All right, next slide. All right, what are we thinking? Spirituality, religion, faith. Anything else? Peace, that's great. Okay, so this is sacredness or purity, sometimes called sanctity. So this foundation was shaped by the psychology of disgust and contamination, and it aligns with anthropologists' theories on how purity and pollution act as symbols for and create social norms. It underlies religious notions of striving to live in an elevated, more noble way. It underlies the widespread idea that the body is a temple that can be desecrated by immoral activities and contaminants, which is an idea that's not unique to religious traditions. If you're in science class and someone passes around a frog in a jar of goo, your first reaction is ew. At least, I don't know if mine is. That can be sacredness and purity. Like, oh, I don't want to touch that. That's icky. That's gross. All right, next slide. Okay, what do we hear? Justice. Okay, what else? Equity. Equality. Okay, love it. So all those are great words, but this is fairness. This is this is the foundation related to reciprocal altruism, and it generates ideas of justice, rights, and autonomy. So, when you're a little kid, you and your siblings or relatives, you want the same thing. Mom, they got a cookie. Why didn't I get a cookie? Fairness. All right. Care. Compassion. Love. Charity. Nurturing. Awesome. Yeah, you guys are right on. This is care for others. This foundation is related to our ability to feel and dislike the pain of others. It underlies virtues of kindness, gentleness, and nurturance. So just to really quickly recap the 5 moral foundations, if you want to, write them down or look at them, they're belonging in community, respect for authority, sacredness and purity, fairness, and care for others.
And they are about to be on the screen again. So all of us have these core moral foundations, like we were saying, whether we know it or not. Maybe we haven't reflected that deeply on some of these values, but we all have them to some degree. So with that said, we do also have conflicts and differences in views, because we give different weight / importance to each of these values, and the interpretations of each of these values can also be different. So that's a huge part of what ends up causing our conflicts and disagreements. People might be speaking from technically the same value, but they are manifesting it differently. They're interpreting it different, and we're going to talk a little more about that. But for now, I do want to see how people are feeling in the room. I'm going to just say each of these, and then you raise your hand if you feel like that value really resonates with you. You do not have to choose just one. Just, raise your hand as led, the ones that feel like you really do place a lot of weight on them. So let's see how we feel in the room. Let's start with belonging and community. Okay. What about respect for authority? Oh, interesting. All right. It seems that we are all on similar pages. Interesting. Sacredness / purity. Okay, a little bit more. Okay. Fairness. Okay. And finally, care for others. All right. So it seems like belonging and community, fairness, care for others had the most hands. That doesn't mean the other 5 or the other 2 don't exist even within your own value system. And also, obviously, in this room, we all hold these values in different ways. But that was an interesting exercise. So I'll hand it over to Micah to keep us going.
Yeah. So there are some clear differences that have been identified across political ideologies, although it could be possible to look at this across other trends. The first is that people who identify as conservative tend to place a similar emphasis across all 5 of these moral foundations. Comparatively, people who identify as more liberal emphasize fairness and care over the other moral foundations. So they would put fairness and care when making decisions, while conservative-leaning peoples would really weigh all of them in a bit more of a comprehensive way. So we want to get into these different interpretations. We outlined what they mean in essence, but even people across the world can interpret them differently and what each of these 5 mean. So the first is belonging and community, sometimes thought of as loyalty. So this moral framework is higher for people who identify as conservative, and they usually interpret it a bit more place-based, thinking of like nationalism, or I'm from Pennsylvania and I love just like, I'm Pennsylvanian. And that's more place-based belonging and community. It's usually lower for people who identify as liberal because they have a more global citizen outlook on what belonging and community looks like. The next, for respect and authority, is again higher for people who identify as conservative and lower for people who identify as liberal for a number of reasons. For sacredness and purity, it is definitely higher for people who identify as conservative, since religion and purity is the way that most people interpret it. And sometimes religious ideologies can really color politics. It's lower for people who identify as liberal, since there's a broader notion of purity and what that looks like. For fairness, it is high for people who identify, it's higher for people who identify as liberal, and they usually interpret it in terms of equality and equity. So this idea, interpretation of fairness is based on outcomes. So it's thought of as, when we get to the finish line, is there equal and equitable representation of people in those spaces? Comparatively, it's lower for people who identify as conservative, and they interpret it more based on merit or meritocracy. This is based on opportunity. So if you give the same opportunity and resources to people, that is what they think of as fair. And then it is based on how much effort and how much work people do to get to that end result, and then whatever those end results are, that's fair. For the final one, for care for others and weighing care versus harm in situations and problem solving, it's higher for people who identify as liberal, as we saw in this room, especially relative to the other moral foundations. Other foundations in decision-making are mediated, are changed and influenced by care for others and weighing that in decision-making. For people who identify as conservative, it's relatively low compared to the other moral foundations. Care is mediated and influenced by the other foundations. They'll weigh it, they'll think about it, but it won't have as much influence or weight when you're making decisions. So I just went through all that. But if you want to take a picture of this, now's the time. Take out those phones.
As we're taking pictures, I think this is a good time to remind everyone that we are a nonpartisan organization. So as we go through all of this, we are really just trying to speak pretty matter of fact about, some of the research that has gone into this workshop. So I just wanted to throw that disclaimer out there, because obviously we're talking very explicitly conservative, liberal, this is higher, this is lower. But as a nonpartisan organization, we're just seeing these as tools to understand, regardless of how you think and what you believe, how to approach someone in a way that they will receive, right? So just wanting to say that as people are taking a photo.
Yeah, thank you so much. And we say that as well because the influence of these moral foundations has actually been studied in people's brains and in neuropsychology. They've literally run brain scans on people while asking them moral foundations questions and noticed that different areas of people's brains are active when they are using different moral foundations. We say this to say because some of these are so ingrained in our ways of thinking and acting that it's no wonder we might feel ineffective when we're trying to talk to someone using a different moral foundation. It's sometimes like we're speaking a different language. And we say this to say that it's important to have an understanding of this, but it's not an end-all for the way you can communicate with someone. With that, Rachel's gonna walk us through how we can use these moral foundations in reframing her experience from 2022.
Yeah, so let's go back to my friend or foe story. So let's use this theory and we'll reframe the visit and interaction in order to figure out an avenue to build connection so that, I could have maybe achieved my goals maybe a little better. So from our side, the lobbying organization side, we were centering our side of the conversation around the two pretty usual moral frameworks for more liberally leaning individuals. So we came in talking about the importance of this bill and how it would allow the United States federal government to investigate the history of Indian boarding schools using a moral foundation of fairness. And then we're talking about the responsibility the US had for the policies it supported in that era, how that wasn't fair. We also focused our stories and our lobbying strategy on informing the Office of the Horrific Conditions and Impact of these boarding schools on Native communities to create a pathway for meaningful reparations and repair of those relationships. This was probably using and leaning heavily on a moral foundation of care for others. So, thinking through the reaction of the staffer and the response that he gave our advocacy on, this particular piece of legislation, a few things kind of, oh, I get it, they become clear. So, one line in particular that one of the other staffers who was also sitting in on the meeting said was that we are not going to do anything else until the Democrats move on our priority legislation. That was the Respect Act that I talked about. So his office was viewing these two pieces of legislation through a belonging and community moral foundation lens. When the office was focused on its discriminatory repeal legislation, they saw the Truth in Healing Commission bill as the Democrat solution, which is not true. This is a completely bipartisan piece of legislation. And they were prioritizing their stuff, the stuff that belonged to them, their bill. In addition to a belonging and community framework, the context that the act passed, I'll just give you some context. So the act that they were focusing on passed a few months after we visited their office, and the Truth in Healing Commission bill had actually just been introduced at that time. So their piece of legislation was more established in Congress. The staffers probably assumed when we came to them to talk about justice for victims of boarding schools, we were going to acknowledge or mention the hard work that they had been doing on this Respect Act, which would have aligned more with a moral framework of respect for authority or acknowledgement for their authority on the subject. So, I'm fairly certain, or I'm pretty persuaded that the staffer responded so strongly and so negatively to my arguments because he was higher in belonging and respect for authority, and we were drawing on care for others and fairness. So there was like a kind of a language barrier almost. In reality, both of us were in support of righting the wrongs of the US government towards Indigenous peoples and communities. We just couldn't see that.
So now that all of you know the basics, we're going to practice a little bit as a group. So we have pulled together a collection of statements on the Truth in Healing Commission from different members of Congress, and you'll see that they do draw on one or more of the moral foundations that we discussed. There could be more than one. We're multifaceted people. People see different things. Also, you might interpret the statements differently. There are no wrong answers here. But I'm going to read the statements that are up on the screen, and we're gonna just shout out, once I'm done reading it, shout out which of the values or moral foundations do you think is really being touched on here. So this is from Senator Elizabeth Warren in Massachusetts. She says, "It is no question that this work will be painful, but it is important and long overdue. The Department of Interior's report was the first time that the federal government acknowledged its role in these policies." So what values or moral foundations are we hearing here? Go ahead and shout them out. Fairness. Care for others. Anyone else? I heard accountability. I heard authority in the back. Yeah, so we ended up saying that we saw care for others and respect for authority. And I think this is important because we were reflecting on how, Senator Elizabeth Warren is a Democratic senator and is a more liberally leaning senator. And so we just heard that people who are more liberally minded will end up emphasizing some of these values, such as care for others, over the other ones. But even so, she is showing a respect for authority in this statement by really mentioning the accountability, the fact that the United States government has a certain role and an authority that they need to acknowledge, and like I said, be accountable to. So another thing that she wrote or said, "It is past time that the voices of survivors and other community members are fully heard. In fact, the final conclusion of the Department of Interior's initial report stated that the federal government has yet to provide this type of forum for survivors, descendants, and their families to voluntarily share their stories." So what are we hearing here? Care for others, fairness. Okay, I'm hearing a couple other ones, but we did say care for others and fairness were the ones that we identified. And then finally, we have a statement from, we never checked how to say this, Representative Jay Obernolte. I'm sorry if I said that wrong. So this person said, there you go. So subpoena authority. Remember, we talked about that legal requirement to hand over documents, right? So subpoena authority, while it might serve the goal of truth, might be adversarial to the goal of healing. And I think that we should have that discussion because I am not sure that serves the purpose of the commission. What do we think? Purity, okay. Someone else said something over here. Authority, okay. Okay, I heard loyalty, like belonging, okay. So we ended up saying care for others. And I want to point this one out as a pretty interesting example too, because technically this person is against the bill, right? They are saying, I don't think so to this bill. Like they're not seeing fully the value of it. So you might be inclined to think like, oh, this person is not showing care for others. In this person's interpretation of care for others, right, they are saying, well, I want to make sure that others are being cared for exactly how they need to be. I want to make sure we are following that goal of healing is, the statement that he is making. So we just want to point out that like, regardless of where you are on the spectrum and regardless of if you're for or against, everyone really does have these 5 values. It's about how you interpret it and like how you're going to manifest that in your ultimate like belief or support or not support of something, right?
Okay, so at this point, we are going to start preparing our minds and teaching you all and practicing how to use this as you prepare for lobbying at the end of this weekend. So you want to start with a couple things. You want to first, hopefully, identify the issue, which is the Truth and Healing Commission, and research your member of Congress, whether that is a senator or your specific representative from where you're coming from. The next is that you want to identify what that member's dominant moral framing on the issue is. This can be a little bit difficult if they are pulling a couple of moral foundations, but it can be really helpful to identify which is their dominant moral framing. You can do this by looking at social media posts, looking at statements they've released, or looking at their website. I know many Congress people have websites that they post about topics and topics that are of importance to them. The next, and which you will have some more time to cultivate in the session following on storytelling, you want to uncover what your dominant moral framing on the issue is. It'll be good to develop that so you know where you're coming from, and also in what places you might need to bridge that gap between your moral framing starting point and their moral framing starting point. As I just mentioned, you're going to use that to bridge the gap. You're going to brainstorm ways to couch your points or ask in moral language that will appeal to your members' moral framing or their office's moral framing. We think of this as a Venn diagram and kind of how we say we look for points of connection. You, who is lobbying, or is going to be bringing what you want, which is uplifting the creation and support of the Truth and Healing Commission. And the person that you're meeting with is going to be bringing with them what they want or what motivates them. What we want to see and what we want to build is that overlap and what you want in terms of what motivates them, so that you will be speaking their language, that you will be pulling from something that speaks within them. On that, Rachel is going to again go through this example on how you can use this when approaching lobbying visits.
So I just want to say I didn't do this until after. So this is an example of how I could have changed our approach. So, this is how I would have incorporated maybe moral foundations into that visit. So the first, again, we're going to identify the issue, which is the, Indigenous peoples and communities, and then our, rights and hopefully reparations. So, research what my member of Congress has said about the issue. So great resources to pull from are their website, press releases, social media, articles, anything you can find that are all really, important pieces of information for us to prepare ourselves to engage on. So, you can even do a quick Google search that says Senator or Representative so-and-so values on Indigenous rights or truth and healing or tribal issues. And then that should give you tons of material to go through. The second thing that we're going to do, again, is determine the member's dominant moral framing on the issue. So from that quick Google search or scouring the web, I can look actually on my member's website and see that his office has a dedicated page to tribal rights, which is pretty rare for most members of Congress. He definitely, recognizes and talks about tribal sovereignty. And his recent work on the issue, again, has focused on accountability for the federal agencies that work with tribal nations. So doing a lot of work with Indian Health Service and the FBI, which provides policing services on reservations. So he's coming from a position of respect for authority, I think pretty clearly, because of his emphasis on the agencies doing what Congress tells them to do. The third thing is that I'm going to be mindful of my moral foundation or framing on the issue. So, I've talked about how it's my community and my family that has been impacted by this issue. And so for me, it's about, belonging in community and, care for the people around me. But, I also agree that truth and healing should be a part of the congressional process of accountability. And so that is something that I can take my moral framing and put it in terms that the staffer might understand. The last thing that we're going to do is practice framing the policy ask in moral foundations, appealing again to that member. Practice or even do it in your lobby visit. Since I see respect for authority with this legislator, I can use that information to reframe the ask or reframe the visit or reframe my story around the Truth and Healing Commission, and maybe talk about the responsibility of the U.S. as our highest national authority or as Congress to investigate what happened during the Indian boarding school era.
So the next, and the Venn diagram again. So the next part of this workshop is about the moral reframing that Rachel just alluded to. So with evidence from Feinberg and Willers, they talk about the importance of this moral reframing and also the effectiveness of it within these persuasive conversations. They talk about how rational arguments and just stark information can sometimes fall short and cause more problems. If you are introducing facts that really are powerful and really are clear to you as to why this is an important issue, if you don't reframe it in a way that shows the person and connects to things that they find important, it can fall short and it can cause those disagreements. The next is connected, but the language and the value of conversations makes a big difference. So connecting with that person, acknowledging what they find important, and then speaking to that can move conversations forward and can build connection in a way that a lot of people overlook. You go right to the details, you go right to the facts, but really connecting with a person on what they believe in and what you believe in, acknowledging that, and moving forward together on an issue that usually you both find important can change the course of a conversation and can change the course of a relationship. So this is our last piece of this workshop, and it is a moral reframing technique that you can use as you are thinking through your lobby visits. So it's adapted from a nonviolent acronym as well called LARA, which is listen, ask, reframe, and affirm. But this one is based on persuasive conversations. That one was just based on understanding and connecting, but we're not only focusing on understanding, but we want to have power in our conversations and be able to persuade someone to know that this is an important ask and this needs to happen. So the first part of this technique is to ask. After you've done all of the research and have been as prepared as possible, you want to engage in conversation with your congressperson or your staffer. Ask questions seeking deeper understanding. You don't want to make assumptions because that can get you in a habit of assuming what another person means, and it can really deter true connection. You also want to approach your conversation with wonder and curiosity. Don't kind of, in relation to the assuming, you don't want to assume the backing of why they're saying what they're saying. You really want to ask and be open to what they're going to say to you. Questions can also vary depending on the topic and the person that you're talking with. It'll evolve as all unique interactions do. The next part of this technique is to listen. If you're going to take the time to ask deep and meaningful questions, you really want to be able to be present and listen with new ears to what that person is saying. You're listening for those places of common ground that you can agree on and that you can understand. No matter if it's small, no matter if you might have overlooked it previously, just taking a moment and saying, oh, I see you, I understand what you're saying, even if it's something small. And honestly, even if it's sometimes not directly related to the issue that you're talking about. If it's like, oh, you grew up in Pennsylvania, you know people who went to Penn State? As you can tell, I love being from Pennsylvania. But those remind you and the person you're talking with that you're both human and that that's the important part and that's the backing behind all of these issues that we're working on. After you've asked and listened to the response, you want to affirm. You want to agree with something, no matter how small. It also helps if you are able to identify the moral foundations, if you haven't previously, that are involved in their response. This is somewhere where you do need to be cognizant. You don't need to agree with something if you, don't make yourself agree or say that you agree with something if you don't. That's why we emphasize, even if it's small and even if it's true, that's all that matters. Because all of these moral foundations are important and we all have them and we all need them, but our truth is sometimes different from other people's truth, and that's okay. The last part of this moral reframing technique within persuasive conversations is to reframe. This is where we've talked about that moral reframing, about coming at an issue, acknowledging and incorporating their moral foundations. So speaking to that. So you want to tie a different moral foundation to the issue, different than your own moral foundation. But you can usually change people's minds when you do this. So Rachel will take it away.
So thinking about all that, moral reframing and foundations, thinking back to that first lobby visit, I think it's like immediately clear, right? We were both talking about policy issues that impact Native communities even in South Dakota, right? My home state. But we came at it with completely different understandings of what the problem is, what the solution is, and how to weigh that in the context of that lobby visit. So just, to reframe or recap, I guess I was using moral foundations of care and fairness and equity. And he was, probably leaning more heavily on authority, belonging, and merit. But what if we had paused, or, us as the lobby group had paused and approached the conversation and the different legislation that we were presented with curiosity and empathy, asking more about what their bill could do to help further Indigenous rights and reparations instead of just moving on and ignoring it because we had no idea what to do. What if we had worked harder to listen intentionally and affirm areas of common ground, like empathizing with the hard work that they had done to push this legislation through Congress, while also, standing firm in our ask that this was an additional piece of legislation that is working towards a solution for the harms of the past and continuing into the present. What would that have looked like? Could it have changed the interaction and the outcome? Probably, yeah. That might have been a better way to approach and then start the conversation, even with the really rocky and honestly disrespectful way that we walked into the room, right? He came at us pretty hot. Realizing that conversation did not go the way that we intended or hoped is not the end of our story, though. Is actually the start. So after we had pulled ourselves together, after we had walked out of that room, I was sobbing. My delegation leader, Paige, who is so amazing, she decided to take another crack at our staffer. She is not one to be deterred. So we had just learned in this talk in 2022 how to reframe our approach to be more effective advocates. So what we did was we all sat down and we figured out how to talk to the staffer in a way that spoke to his values and that of the office. And we did this in our follow-up email. You'll learn more about that over the weekend. So the first thing that we did was we described how this bill addressed longstanding issues in our own community, South Dakota. South Dakota had dozens of boarding schools, which thousands of children attended. We discussed how this bill is necessary for the federal government to implement because only Congress has the authority to federally address congressional action, right? It's not enough that the Department of Interior is doing their own wonderful work. Congress has to take a stand on the issue. The second thing that we did was that we emphasized how the Truth and Healing Bill would take accountability for the past wrongs that the United States had done. We framed it with a moral framework of respect for the authority that the United States has since it created the policies and funding to run these boarding schools. We also discussed how the bill is necessary for the federal government to implement because only Congress, again, has the authority to address this kind of action. So after we sent that email, I actually went to work as an Advocacy Corps organizer that summer on Truth and Healing. And during that time, back in DC, I had the opportunity to meet with that same office multiple times, actually, throughout that year. And the first time I met with them again, alone, walking back into that congressional office building, the staffer who wasn't in that meeting saw me in that office and apologized for the way that he had behaved. He used the words, "I think I was a little bit intense." Yeah, I think, that would summarize it. So while, the legislator still has not agreed to be a co-sponsor of the legislation, obviously we're still working on it. Every lobby visit that I have had with that office was always respectful moving forward. I felt like the staffers were always listening. They were always taking notes. They were always actively engaging with what I was saying. So, I wanted to share this story with you, not to scare you, not to freak you out. Again, this is like totally out of the norm, but it's important because we didn't get the result that we wanted, right? They haven't co-sponsored the legislation. The bill still hasn't passed, but we built important, lasting relationships with that office that have worked in other ways. I've had wonderful visits with them. I had 25 people on one of my last visits with that office. And I'm excited to continue to build on those relationships moving forward. So if you're in the South Dakota delegation, let's get on it.
So to close, since we're at the end of the hour, whether or not you use or take away all or some of the information that we have presented with you during this presentation, we hope that you have realized in some sense that by establishing a connection with the person that you are meeting with and building on mutual respect in yourself and with people that you are meeting with, especially those that you disagree with, can make lasting connections and can make the persuasive conversations and lobbying and advocacy that you're doing so much more effective. As we've mentioned, engaging with people that you disagree with can be really intimidating and it can be anxiety provoking, but it can be really powerful. They may be the ones who have power within Congress to make changes, but you have power too, especially this room full of powerful young advocates who are the future. You have power, your voice, your story, and your presence reminds legislators about what is most important in the work that they are doing. I'm so grateful to be here with you all, and I thank Rachel for sharing that story, although it is an intense story and a not ideal situation for a first lobbying experience. But by persevering and by reaching out across that gap and building on the connections that she was able to see, she demonstrated the transformative nature of FCNL's work and approach to advocacy. So, as we continue on, this is only the first day of this long and powerful weekend. I hope that you feel empowered to go and find some friends in unlikely places. You did it!